Good morning, everyone. From Cape Breton to Cape May and from Niagara Falls to Falls River, welcome to everyone listening to Free Atlantic Radio this morning. This is the voice of the Northeastern Nation. I am your host, Tom Kaczynski, for the podcast that covers what is going on in our region that no one else will touch. Thank you for tuning in this morning. I want to say appreciate each and every one of you. Remind you, if you have any questions, send them to New Albion, ALBION, at protonmail.com. We're going to have a mailbag episode this weekend. Anyone who wants to send support along, Venmo is CVCPRV. And I am working to get our Voices platform launched. We'll have more on that in the coming days. And all of this will eventually be up at AtlanticHomeland.com. Until we can get that going, we do have the website already active at free-atlantic-radio /castos.com. So you have the opportunity to listen to everything there, and we will have this on all the major platforms. So our new theme for how we do this thing is every week I ask a new question, and the question today I'm going to ask is, what is legitimacy? And we'll start with a definition that comes from the Oxford Dictionary of 1986. And we'll use the word legitimate because legitimacy is just the state of having such. And the adjective means in accordance with the law or rules, or logically acceptable or justifiable. And today's episode is really about that second version we were talking about. What is justified? What is justice? And as we look at that question, we hear a lot of people out in the streets talking about social justice and racial justice and economic justice. And there's always this promise that you could create equality, and there's a willingness to do as much destruction as is required. And so then we should ask, well, what represents legitimate action? Because that is ultimately what this fight is about, and who is legitimate. And so we have to think about this whole question of legitimacy, and legitimacy with respect to what we see from our government has, in the Western tradition for a very long time, come from one of two reasons. In the older version of Western history, what legitimacy derived from was this idea that you were following the higher order, the rules that came down from God through the Christian tradition, or even outside of Western society, whatever their whatever the commonly prescribed mandate was. These laws would be followed, they would be endorsed, they would be supported by the people, and because the people supported these laws, whomever upheld those laws was seen as having legitimacy for serving the interests of the people. Now, once upon a time, this was somewhat simpler, where people agreed upon the set of rules and the set of order, but the Enlightenment began to change that. And to consider that a little more deeply, we have to think about the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And what he said, he wrote a book called The Social Contract. And in The Social Contract, what his basic argument ended up being was that the state was a contract with the individual people rather than a ruler over the people. The idea happened that the consent of the governed was required for the state to have legitimacy, and in response, it would be the responsibility of the state to look out for the goodness or the safety and welfare of the people. Quote, "As soon as any man says of the affairs of the state, what does it matter to me? The state may be given up for lost." End quote. And so what ended up happening out of this was this idea that we, as the people within our country, within our nations, have the right to have the expectation that if we are going to lend our support to whatever state we live in, and by state I mean nation, country, and the political entity that is affixed above them, then we should have reasonable expectations of what we want. In the United States, these ideas were built upon in the Bill of Rights and in the various laws that followed from that, from the Constitution, and the idea that we had certain liberties that were protected. The right to free speech, the right to assembly, the right of free practice of faith, which conveys a right of conscience, and the right to bear arms, the right against unreasonable search and seizure, the right against self-incrimination. And within the Constitution, although it's very infrequently commented upon, the Ninth Amendment makes clear that not only do we have these rights, but they are not considered all-inclusive, that rights are generally saved to the government, that is to say reserved, unless they were delegated to the states. Delegated to the federal government, I apologize, where they were constrained in some sort of way because of an institutional need agreed upon as a necessity for the safety and security of the people. So, we ask all these details to come back to our original question: what is legitimacy? Well, when we're talking about a state, it's the idea of a state that has the respect of the people, and the respect of the people rationally should follow from the desire to provide equal protection to all of its citizens, to provide for their safety, for their welfare, and to provide, most importantly, equal protection under law. Because if you have unequal enforcement of rule, then you cannot help but have anything but a tyranny. Now, tyranny is a word that's thrown around quite a bit, but all tyranny means at the root of it is that laws are being unequally enforced in a given area, where one set of rules applies to one people under the government and another set of rules applies to another. And if you look at the United States of America from that perspective of what represents tyranny, there's a lot of talk made about privilege in this idea of justice. And privilege is the idea that one is treated differently within the construct of the state than others. So let me just ask the question: when we think of privilege, if you were applying for a job, what peoples are privileged in terms of having advantages as warranted by the state? Well, certain groups are hired just because of their racial color or because of their background. Or in another example, in the reverse, you have a situation in the United States where it is the case that you can't be fired for being black, but you can be fired for being white. So when you look at this, there is an inequality of justice that exists within the state, because what happened was people began listening to this idea that certain groups needed protection. And this began controversially with the Civil Rights Act of 1963. Now, what ended up happening, and I think everyone agrees with the idea that rights should apply equally to all citizens of a given nation. Certainly that's been the ambition of the American nation for a very long time. But Lyndon Johnson set us on a path that was very different, where in a maelstrom of anger and anguish over the death of Jack Kennedy, the country went ahead and passed a set of legislations that, while theoretically were designed to heal the racial divisions in this country, in fact, they have exacerbated them to the point where we now have the issues that emerge from Black Lives Matter and all the various issues that are out there, Antifa, all these organizations, because what they did was they created cultural warfare when they created the idea that some groups were more legitimate than others. Because the claims of the victims were judged as more legitimate to the claims of their fellow citizens, there were gerrymandered districts that were created in the United States. There was this idea that there would be equalization programs where resources were taken from one group and given to another. And these were not done as voluntary methods. These were force put on the government by the government to change the way people behaved. And it was done in an arbitrary way where certain groups were considered more important than other groups. One can argue with some justification the United States prior to 1963 did other things than that. And that very well may be true in the social setting. But the problem is when government replaces a problem in society through a tyranny of its own, what it does is it destroys its own legitimacy and justification. Because then government ceases to be a state that serves for the interest of all of its people, which is what Rousseau and most Americans, I believe, think government should do, and instead it becomes a force to be used by one side to persecute and prosecute the other. And if you look at the way that we treat government right now as a ping pong ball, where we have an empire in the United States that is basically being fought over by different factions who seek to punish their enemies, as Senator Kamala Harris of California so clearly said, or as Valerie Jarrett said, former advisor to President Barack Obama. What you find is that there is a militancy, there is a ruthlessness that comes along, and Rousseau talked about this as well in the social contract. He said, usurpers always bring about or select troublous times to get past under cover of the public terror, destructive laws which the people would never adopt in cold blood. The moment chosen is the one of the surest means of distinguishing the work of the legislator from that of the tyrant. And for all the talk you hear about President Trump being a tyrant, which I am no fan of his, but ultimately he has been following the law to the point of losing his own base, that we are now watching where the law has been pushed aside and legitimacy has gone over to the mob. They have angrily taken control, and their allies in support financially have been able to use this to destroy legitimacy. Consider the sad case of Mark McCloskey, lawyer who lives in an affluent neighborhood in St. Louis, who has had his weapons seized from him against the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution for defending his property against, quote, peaceful protesters, end quote, who broke the opening to his gate, who went onto his property, who threatened the health and safety of his wife, himself, his animals, and all his ownings, and against which the police would not come because they knew they had no political authority to stand against a prosecutor's office that literally has gone ahead and shamed and attacked the victim, against a governor who hasn't had the gumption to stand up despite being a Republican against the anger and justice of the mob, against a system that says you're the bad guy for wanting to protect what you own, what you earned, what you've built, against the violence threatened by the mob. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the abdication of the state, ranging from the St. Louis Police Department to the Missouri State Police, the Missouri National Guard, the Circuit Attorney for St. Louis, the Attorney General for the state of Missouri, all the way up to the President of the United States. What we have learned is that some people will be given money for agitating. They will be allowed to commit violence. The people who exist to uphold the laws will be removed from them and applied only to those who stand against them. And that we now have a situation in this country where we cannot expect to be defended under the law. We cannot expect the courts to treat us fairly. We cannot expect the police to provide protection. We cannot expect the government to look out for the interests of all people. Because it is now okay in the United States to violate the rights and liberties of certain people. And so we go to the question of justice and legitimacy once more. If your government is unwilling to defend you, if your government is unwilling to defend its own laws, if your government is unwilling to defend social order and peace and tranquility, then what government do we have but a tyranny, and a tyranny that represents the interest of the mob? And that is what we see, a corporate oligarchy which owns both the protesters and the government, and serves as middlemen to facilitate the destruction of what was once a great nation. I know the hardest message that we give on Free Atlantic Radio is this idea that we need to form a new nation. And I know many people have great love for the United States, its long history, and the service that the best people have rendered to her. Yet, when we look at what services have done, what society have we created? Our patriotism was funneled into fighting wars overseas for cynical ends that did not advance the safety and security of the homeland, but instead narrow interest within it. And while I have no doubt that people who went over there to serve in all of our various wars did so with the highest of intentions, it is often the case that intent alone is not enough, for if your own society does not look to its own welfare, to its own good, to following the laws it prescribes, to making sure the liberties it speaks to are defended, all of our wars that we've had since World War II, since World War I, have only served to defer and deny those liberties, to destroy the moral basis upon which America rests, to replace the stock of the people who were here who sought to act in good character and good courage, and to defame those who were most responsible for the creation of this nation. And that was no accident, because to make a new thing, you must destroy an old thing. This is why Christianity is under attack. This is why the male-female traditional relationship of marriage is under attack. This is why families are under attack, and Black Lives Matter says publicly on their platform, we do not support the idea of traditional fatherhood. You can look these things up. This is why you see violence in the streets, and even as I'm recording now at about 6 a.m. Eastern Time, riots are still ongoing in Portland and Seattle where there's no will to stop it. The city of Minneapolis and the state of Minnesota have asked the federal government for $500 million to reconstruct the city they refuse to defend, going ahead and assuming that you owe an obligation to them to give your money over to people who were allowed to destroy things that were not theirs, were kept from justice for their crimes against individuals and property, who were encouraged to enact violence as a means to spread fear and intimidation, against which the police vacated their standing, as they did in Seattle, by the way, in the chop shop, in the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, and as we see city after state doing, whether it's New York City cutting its budget, we see overwhelmingly that our political class has decided that they are going to give justice over to the mob. We see Washington paralyzed by partisanship and indecision. We see a president unable or unwilling to act. And we see the Bureau of Justice, the Department of Justice, which is supposed to stand up for the rights and welfare of people, doing the exact opposite. They go ahead and protect the guilty and attack the innocent. I don't know what else you could call criminality and illegitimacy, but ladies and gentlemen, I think there's nothing more compelling than that argument. And so let me say this. The American nation has died. It died because no one was willing to defend it against the American state. And this is a sad reality, but this requires us to form a new nation and a new state where we remember the words of not just Rousseau, but many great thinkers who understood that if you are going to have justice, the equal application of it to all people across all groups under a commonly agreed upon center is required. I understand and have commented frequently upon us not having that center of values. But within the United States, we at least should have had a center in law where arson, rioting, looting, destruction of property, terrorization, even rape and assault are not allowed. And yet, these things are not just being allowed, but being enabled by the very political class in charge. And what I would suggest to you is you have now not only no obligation, but you have a duty not to remit your taxation to them, not to give your consent. Because if you do, then you are asking for them to commit the same violence against you. And surrendering to that, whether or not you think you're going to be the first one called out or the last one, can only end up in one place, where the mob uses its violence to destroy all that it does not like in support of a larger goal that it has. We'll talk about that goal in the future. We'll talk about Antifa, about the neo-Bolshevik revolution that's ongoing, and why the neoliberal elites are allowing it. It may just be that they are allowing these things to get so bad so that you will give ultimate power over to them because you don't want to have these dangers exist. And Lord knows none of us do. 90% of Americans vigorously and vehemently oppose what is happening in our country, and yet there is no political person to speak to it, which makes you realize that the political class is part of it. And whether it be Democrats or Republicans, whether it be Washington or your state capital, from Albany to Boston, or even if it's up in Ottawa, where I know it is the case that if people were to speak out against things that they did not want, they're sent for mental health counseling. I'm well aware of the struggles that our Canadian brothers have up there. These all speak to the same idea that you are not allowed to speak for your rights, for your concerns, and what you think is legitimate. You are not guaranteed equal protection under law. And that has to change. So as we go forward with this, let me add one other piece of legitimacy. The state has imposed its authority, not its legitimacy, through the use of force, through those people it pays in its employ who take oaths which they try to uphold to provide for justice, to serve and uphold the law. And now a choice is coming for those people. For my brothers and sisters in law enforcement, the thin blue line, who are you serving? Do you serve the people or do you serve the tyrants? And this is a decision you'll have to make beyond your paycheck, beyond your pension, beyond what the unions say, beyond what the media says. Because you who have seen the streets and who understand what happens when the thin veneer of civilization is removed and violence is allowed to be profligate, you will have to make a decision about what is legitimate, and you have the means to enact that change. Firstly, through your action to remove yourself from serving an illegitimate regime, and secondly, through committing yourself as dedicated warriors, as knights in defense of the realm of the people who require your protection now. One of the concepts of the Atlantic Nation that we'll cover more in future days is this idea that we have that there are different groups within a society that serve a purpose in accordance with our 4 core values. I mention these values often because they're at the core of what we are trying to accomplish here. These values being reason, nature, grace, and loyalty. Let's talk about loyalty a little bit for one moment. One thing that I always say with loyalty is it comes down to this statement. I will use my talents honorably, serving others in good faith and with integrity. I will protect them. I will be a knight. We have men and women who have put themselves on the line and for whom we have been grateful. We need you now. And you will have to do the hardest thing you have ever done in your lives. You will have to decide if the law is legitimate still, if the people who are responsible for creating it and upholding it are not doing so. If they are making it impossible, one prosecutor, corrupt and bought at a time, and one own judge, appointed to cynically ignore those laws it doesn't like, in a broken system. Are you going to go ahead and follow the dictates of an increasingly tyrannical state who's going to give people over to the mob? Or are you going to go ahead and adopt something different and stand for the legitimacy of the people who demand protection and equal law? This Atlantic project, this nation that's burgeoning within the roots of the United States, will spring like Athena from the head of Zeus, and it will come out fully armed and ready to fight if you will stand with us and bring the force of Nike behind us. That's what we need. We need you to defend us now because our leaders don't know how to defend themselves. They don't care. They've sold out. And we are alone. We are vulnerable. We are targets. And as we go into the discussion today, I want to demonstrate to you the miscarriage of justice that is the United States at this point. You need to understand just how bad it is. And we're going to talk about the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm often told there are many good people within that agency, and I want to believe that. But I know your leadership is targeting the decent Americans who are out there, and I know because I've been one for a very long time. But I'm not asking you to believe me, although I suspect most of you will. I'm going to share some information with you, a couple leaks that came out, because there was a huge dump called Blue Leaks that came out as of June 22nd. And this was a document trove of many, many documents about what is happening in America today, internal reports of police and federal departments that were talking about the violence in our streets and who was ultimately responsible. The media will tell you it's white supremacists or the hate of Christians. But the internal documents tell you the complete opposite, that as you can see with your very eyes, the people who are rioting in the streets are far-left activists who are being budgeted and supported and bolstered by a neoliberal elite. And the police know it. They just haven't been willing to act because they don't know where their loyalty lies. Let's look at just one article and then a couple documents that were declassified that should not have been publicly released, but I want you to hear what we are facing in our streets. So this piece is by the Computer Business Review, CBR Online. Claudia Glover wrote this on June 2nd, 2020. Huge data dump of police files dubbed Blue Leaks leaked online. The eventual outcome of this leak will likely have disastrous effects for many innocent people. Nearly 270 gigabytes of sensitive files, including the FBI Fusion Center and police department data from across the United States dubbed Blue Leaks, has been stolen and leaked online on June 19th by a collective called DDoS Secrets. And as I suspect the people my interjection here, as I suspect the people who did this were actually good servants of the law, who were trying to do the right thing, who wanted to let the public know what they were being forced to, let me just say thank you for your courage. You know, our founders had to take treasonous acts before they could have justice. We may have to do the same, and I know that's scary for people, but I want you to understand this. Fusion centers are the hubs for intelligence and threat sharing. The concept was created after September 11th in a bid by the Department of Homeland Security to improve cooperation between state, local, and territorial law enforcement. The National Fusion Center Association says the data was taken after a security breach at a web development firm, NetCentral, in Houston, Texas. It includes 490 documents pertaining to the UK. Computer Business Review was not immediately able to open to assess these documents. It also had a great many documents about the U.S. because I've seen some of these. DDoS Secrets stated that the Blue Leaks archive spans 10 years of data from over 200 police departments, fusion centers, and other law enforcement training and support resources. Among the hundreds of thousands of documents are police and FBI reports, bulletins, guides, and more. Investigating security review site Krebs on Security obtained an internal analysis by the NFCA confirming the validity of the leaked data. The association divulged that the data goes as far back as August 1996 all the way through to its release on June 19th in America. So this has a whole bunch of information, and I'm not going to try to copy all of it because Lord knows my goal here is not to put police officers more at risk. But I do want you to hear what they put out as bulletins to themselves, because I want you to hear in these pieces, some of these pieces are from a couple years ago, what our government has known for years about the violent protesters in the streets who have nothing to do with George Floyd and the miscarriage of justice that happened in that situation. Everyone understands that at this point. We're going to start with a piece from the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center. And even though this is outside of our Atlantic homeland, this is a good piece for us to have an understanding of just what sort of tactics are being done. And keep in mind, you tell me if this looks like what you're seeing in the streets here. That this is an update. Violent tactics showcased at Berkeley riots likely to be used at future demonstrations. Violent anti-fascist tactics showcased at events in Berkeley on the 1st of February, 4th of March, and 15th of April 2017 highlight their ability to exploit peaceful protests with coordinated violent demonstrations, attack law enforcement personnel, destroy property, and conduct information campaigns to advance their socio-political goals. This advisory bulletin is intended to inform law enforcement involved in operational planning and event safety at gatherings that violent anti-fascist elements may target. So this was in 2017, right? Back before anyone was even really talking about Antifa, when the whole media was talking about the evil white supremacists who went out there at places like Charlottesville to defend the history of not having the statues torn down, which we see torn down by the thousands today. Why does that happen? Because they want to erase your history. And as they start pulling down, and in 3 different places just this weekend, they defaced the Virgin Mary and committed arson against a church in California, consider that this is becoming something that's being enabled where no one is ever found guilty, no one is ever prosecuted, no one is ever grabbed. And what happens? The Justice Department, the number of prosecutors who were paid for by the Open Society Foundation, George Soros, color revolutions, all of these actors acting within the country, a political class unwilling to ask, a violent mob in the streets, and officers who are told don't show up. I can accept that, but the people need you to show up, not to defend a state that doesn't stand for itself, but for a nation. And whether it be in California, Texas, Washington, or up here in the Atlantic homeland, we need law. We need order. We need security. We need men and women who are bravely willing to stand with us. Warriors who will fight the ugly fight, even though no one will stand with them. Now is the time for the sheepdogs to run. Here's what we face. We assess that violent anti-fascist, Antifa, including anarchist elements, are likely to coordinate and drill tactics for use at organized events in the San Francisco Bay Area. Recently observed tactics suggest that some violent anti-fascists may have had access to military-style training or knowledge, possibly from publicly accessible guerrilla warfare manuals, books, and online media content. And we actually know some of them went over and fought in Syria. Tactics witnessed at riots in Berkeley in 2017 include black blocs. Violent anti-fascists have participated in black blocs where participants dress uniformly in black clothing, including black ski masks and black scarves. They carry accessories such as backpacks to conceal weapons, carry new clothing and first aid along with other provisions. Uniformity aids in the concealment of participant identities to evade arrest. And we've seen this, and how much more convenient is it that everyone now has to wear a mask, so now no one can be prosecuted. Even though in the city of New York, Mayor Bill de Blasio has gone out there and said that these people can protest, but you can't even go walk in the park. Where are you, police? Improvised incendiary devices, fireworks, and other explosions. Violent anti-fascists have been observed employing both commercial and homemade pyrotechnics, including suspected M80s, Roman candles, improvised incendiary devices, and smoke bombs. We've also heard of stories of this being interrupted with pipe bombs against instances of Department of Homeland Security, of the Border Patrol, of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, right? Let's continue. Swarming. Large groups of violent anti-fascists have been observed engaging in collective attacks with high coordination and with seemingly limited leadership or communication. Swarming results when individuals and groups overwhelm their targets by attacking en masse. Cacheting weapons. At the 4th March and the 15th of April Berkeley rallies, authorities identified and seized weapons cached by violent anti-fascists near their targeted venues. Cached locations included construction sites, newsstands, and other opportunistic sites. Remember when the riots were just starting for George Floyd, how you saw huge blocks of bricks put for convenient locations to make things happen more aggressively. This is what you're seeing in your streets, and the government's known about it for years and done nothing. Area denial. Violent anti-fascists have been observed gathering local materials to construct traffic obstacles such as roadblocks. They have constructed roadblocks from road improvement site materials, dumpsters, trash cans, cinder blocks, and other non-secure materials including garbage. Violent anti-fascists infrequently ignite these materials to divert first responder resources. Not so infrequently these days, right? Roadblocks deny access points to first responders by preventing traffic movement and tying up resources. When people were dying and being held hostage in CHOP, EMS couldn't get there for people who died, including children, because this was permitted. And the mayor, where was she? She didn't care. Mayor Jenny didn't care in Seattle until someone brought the mob to her house, and only then did she start doing things. Human shields. Violent anti-fascists have been observed integrating into crowds of peaceful actors, limiting law enforcement response options. Element of surprise. Violent anti-fascists have avoided early detection at multiple events by assembling at off-site locations before collectively moving to a given venue, creating an element of surprise over responding authorities. However, on the 27th of August, violent anti-fascists were observed masking up while en route to an event. Reconnaissance and surveillance. They have displayed evidence of pre-operational reconnaissance. Intelligence gleaned from surveillance provides criminal elements key knowledge about event security gaps and infiltration opportunities. Communication and anonymization. They have been observed implementing multiple overlapping communication platforms, including handheld radios, megaphones, encrypted phone apps such as Signal, rally markers, flags, and peace doves, and command and response words, allowing them to continuously coordinate their actions if one method is compromised or fails. So just so you understand this, we're going to continue here, but you need to know this is a paramilitary attack using terror to compel America into submission. This is the equivalent of what the Freikorps did in Germany. This is the equivalent of the Red Guards under Mao, or, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the violent Islamists who destroyed a once wealthy, prosperous state in Iran, the great Persian civilization. This is a military in our midst that literally is being put into place to replace you, the police, and to leave us, the people, unsafe. And we are letting it happen because we are adhering to laws in anarcho-tyranny that the people who are breaking are not held to account to. That Mark McCloskey may go to jail for defending his property, where the people who broke into his house are not even questioned for prosecution. How can we be okay with this? How can this be legitimate? How can you go, if you wear a badge, and be accepting that this is how you're going to be used? And I understand there are places that aren't like this. But when you have illegitimate orders, just like they teach in the military, it is your legal duty to not follow them. And I would suggest that at this point, none of these orders coming through are legitimate unless they're for the safety of people, of property, and the equal enforcement of law for all people, and not allowing riotous mobs to own our cities. And I have no delusion that this is going to continue. And that if we consent to this, by not speaking out, by not organizing against it, by not building an alternative model, well, then we are just waiting until they take over D.C., and then all the forces of the military are used against us. That's when the FEMA camps come. That's when the dangers come where mass death happens. And it hasn't happened in America before, but just because it hasn't doesn't mean it won't. It hadn't happened in Russia before the Red Death. It hadn't happened in China before Mao. It hadn't happened in France before the guillotines. This is what we're dealing with. And we could go on. There's other stuff in here. I'll just go through a little bit more here. A couple things. Distributed denial of service attacks. Anarchist-affiliated malicious cyber actors have previously launched distributed denial of service attacks against law enforcement institutions and are suspected to have carried out unattributed attacks against law enforcement agencies, coinciding with anti-fascist and anti-capitalist demonstrations. These attacks can shut down websites or otherwise slow access to computer systems. If that isn't domestic terrorism, what is? And you don't even hear about this. They swept it under the rug. Why? Because politically our leadership wants this. Why? Because they want to destroy our liberties so they can control us. And they're willing to let the mob have their way with you. That is not legitimacy. That is theft. That's theft of sovereignty from you, and you deserve better than this. Whatever your aspirations, this is cynical and sordid. Graffiti. Officers have reported seeing spray-painted messages on walls and other areas at violent events, informing other participants to use particular communications platforms, use Signal, as well as Signal Room IDs. Authorities have also observed improvised devices used to vandalize large areas with graffiti. Unmanned aerial vehicles. On the 27th of August, YouTube user Horace Eye, claiming a non-affiliated status, operated a camera-mounted UAV recording much of the day's events, with a focus on anti-fascist organizers while frequently identifying officer locations, numbers, and formations. UAVs have been used to record other similar events. So you literally have advanced scouting for paramilitary forces going around destroying a city where the law enforcement is not acting or is restrained from acting, where the prosecutors don't hold people to account, where the laws are not enforced, and the expense is borne out by the people. This is illegitimate, ladies and gentlemen. This is not just illegitimate. This is evil. This is destructive, and it stands against everything that law should, which is the idea that it's here to protect all of us. I understand people have issues and that they have questions about how things should work in this society. The Atlantic Nation talks about that. We are not a left or right-wing organization. We just want to escape from the chaos that is the American situation, the cynicism that is the Canadian Dominion. We are looking to build something new. And here's what they concluded. And this was their own conclusions. This is from, like I said, this is from the Joint Terrorism Task Force, I believe, the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center. That's who did this, okay? Outlook. Law enforcement is likely to encounter similar violent tactics where peaceful protests are co-opted by violent anti-fascists in the future. Peaceful protests you hear about for George Floyd, perfect opportunity for anti-fascists to run around. And what is anti-fascism anyway, right? Fascism, if you understand it properly, is an economic term that means that the alliance between the state and corporations in service of ends work together. What do we have? Black Lives Matter, as funded by every corporation you're spending money at. Okay, that's fascism. They call themselves always what they are, and they accuse you of being that when you're the opposite. It's crazy. Law enforcement may also face new evolving techniques from violent anti-fascist and anarchist extremists who have multiple online and offline resources available to draw upon, including largely the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the leadership groups, the district attorney offices, and the city polices of most major metropolitan areas in the United States. This, ladies and gentlemen, is ongoing sedition. Violent anti-fascists may attempt to develop new tactics targeting law enforcement that can provoke responding officers into using perceived excessive force against populations consisting of both violent and non-violent attendees. If police are perceived to respond with excessive force against peaceful protesters, it could embolden violent anti-fascist calls to increase violence against law enforcement. They're doing that, and they're getting the politicians who have no understanding of what they're doing, either that or they are cynically bought out, to destroy the ability to defend anyone from the violence they want to use in support of justice. But whose justice is it? The justice of immediately enforcing your tyranny on another? That's what we're being given in the United States. That is the situation on the ground today. And as we look at a country where we have nearly 50 million people unemployed, perhaps even more than that, where we have the threat of a second lockdown upon us to go ahead and destroy our economic capacity to exist, and we see angry hordes just waiting for Labor Day and for a situation where more people will be hurt and angered by the failure of our government to not only protect our laws, but to look out for the economic welfare of our people, it's not hard to predict that, in fact, we will see the destruction of this country accelerate very quickly. This country does not have the will to defend itself. It does not have the sanction of the very laws it's written because it will not defend them, and the people are left with no other option. That's why we started Free Atlantic Radio, to throw up the pines and lines for the good people of not just New England, our home territory, or the Mid-Atlantic, the Maritimes, and all these places, but we wanted to go ahead and put out a message about legitimacy. What will you stand up for? And to ask for those who understand this in the small towns and the small cities, and even in the big cities where people say you're in Brooklyn, you have a right to safety and security as much as anyone else does, and yet your leadership is not giving it to you. Your law enforcement would provide that for you. New York was one of the safest cities in the world up until relatively recently, and yet one man who was elected in a process, you don't know if those votes were legitimate. You don't know what those machines tabulated. You don't know any of these things, and we're going to allow one person to become a tyrant because the majority put a bunch of numbers into a machine? I don't think so. We've reached the point where the struggle is going to be liberty versus democracy. That's what I was going to call my book Incoming. And that's what we're facing now. And for those who want to stand up for liberty, now is the time to be counted. And it isn't about the Republic, because the Republic has fallen. It fell because it got bought and sold a long time ago. Democrats and Republicans alike. The silence is deafening. Now it's time for the people to take charge and to decentralize things once more, and for law enforcement to step up a little bit more. Let's look at the final conclusion from this report. Increased law enforcement in temporary city ordinances on the 14th of September and the 24th to the 27th of September were likely responsible for decreased violent activity. What a surprise. When the police do their job, people are kept safe. Although multiple law enforcement agencies believe the events on the 14th of September and from the 24th to 27th were very likely to be co-opted by violent anti-fascists, both events occurred with minimal to no violence. The city of Berkeley authorized emergency ordinances restricting the wearing of masks and face coverings, which will never be allowed now, so people will go around dangerously. Allowed for no warning of arrest, which is not allowed, and banned specific items that could be used as weapons from being carried within several blocks of the organized events. Whereas in Seattle, now they banned the police from protecting themselves. And you can see a video of, for instance, in New York, where an officer in Brooklyn was beat up, or not Brooklyn, in the Bronx, was being beat up for just going ahead and trying to walk his beat. Additionally, the city of Berkeley enlisted mutual aid officers from adjacent counties to help enforce the ordinance. Strict enforcement greatly increased the likelihood of arrest among violent individuals, likely decreasing their desire to engage in criminal activity. But now, in the COVID crisis, what do? We let everyone in the streets. We don't hold anyone. There's no bail. There's no bond. There's no police. There's no law. There's no order. There's no state. There's no legitimacy. There's no hope in the United States of America. And decent people are waiting and wondering who will stand up for us, who will speak for us. Well, I'm one guy. I can't do it alone. But I can tell you what needs to happen. And it doesn't take a genius to figure this out, that we need people who will stand up. Where is the thin blue line when it's needed? Are you going to let politicians keep you from doing your job? Are you going to let judges corrupt justice? Or will you step up and figure a way to become part of leadership of something that will stand up for law and order? Will sheriffs stand up for their counties, and many have, and God bless each and every one of them? Will police departments say, the criminals that we are dealing with are our own leaders? And we do not want mob justice. That is not what we seek. We want the protection and equal enforcement of law, of liberty. That's what we require. And since this government won't enforce its Bill of Rights, we are going to begin articulating a new one that is stronger, that is better, that is simpler, and is more honest as part of the free Atlantic nation. That's what we want to do. Because we don't need to throw out all the things that were good. We aren't trying to take from one to give to another. That's not justice. That's violence. And whether it's against stuff or against people, it's still wrong. But people don't know what right and wrong are about because we don't talk about that anymore. We're scared. We want to be economically safe. We want to be medically safe. We want to be safe from violence. And for fear, people are willing to give away everything. It's time we change that. It's time we show courage. It's time we show bravery. And that we show legitimacy comes from the consent of the governed. Let's go a little further. Let's go into our region a little bit. Another piece I wanted to share with you. This is from the Boston Regional Intelligence Center. This was from an event that was on the Boston Common in Massachusetts on the 19th of August, 2017. This is, like I said, the Boston Regional Intelligence Center. So we're just going to read a couple things here that ended up happening. Background. The following is a summary of noted events leading up to and criminal activity reported during events in and around Boston Common on the 19th of August, 2017. Please note this information is preliminary and based on current reporting of events that transpired. Background. The second Boston Free Speech Rally was organized on publicly available social media in July of 2017. The Boston Regional Intelligence Center was aware of the event due to criminal activity at the previous free speech rally and counter events held in May 2017. And you notice how there's always these counter events, right? That's the violence. Prior to the event in May, online interactions between opposing groups was contentious. Approximately 300 to 400 people attended the first free speech rally and counter events. There were 2 arrests for affray related to these events. Prior to the violence in Charlottesville, the second Boston Free Speech Rally had not attracted much attention. There was no indication of counter events, and there was no indication of any planned criminal activity or risk to public safety. The events in Charlottesville heightened tensions and brought an increased level of awareness to the second Boston Free Speech Rally. And let me just say, the city of Charlottesville commissioned an independent report about what happened in the events down there, and you should go and seek to find it, because if you actually read it, what they conclude is that the violence that happened there was caused by the police not doing their job because the politicians told them not to, and they made it impossible for them to protect the people who were exercising their rights of free speech. And as usual, the mob got to have its way, and then the whole narrative was set up where people who were trying to defend history, rightly or wrongly, but who had every right to make that statement, were literally painted into the villains, just as you and I will be if we go ahead and speak up for anything that existed before what the violent mob requires. And you see how fast it moves along these days. Let's continue here. While the events in Charlottesville did not appear to impact numbers for the second Boston Free Speech Rally, we saw the development and rapid increase in expected attendance at counter events. At this time, the BRIC noted an increase in the potential for criminal activity as posts on publicly available social media were contentious and threatening. The second Boston Free Speech Rally and applied for and was granted a permit on the 16th of August, 2017. The counter events were not permitted. The second Boston Free Speech Rally had approximately 60 attendees, while the counter events swelled to an estimated 40,000. Boston Police Department made 36 arrests related to these events. So, and I will say a lot of those people got paid to show up. It happens all the time. And you see this. You could hear stories. There's a ton of them out there of these things happening. But people go out there because they like to tell a little story. And you can see these sort of things. But I want to just grab a couple key points to this here that was really important, I think, relevant to what was said here. Criminal activity, prior threats and information reported, right? The majority of publicly available postings in relation to the event were noted to be contentious, with many advocating for self-defense and preparing for violence by bringing defensive weapons to include batons and shields. The BRIC noticed an increase in uncorroborated threats of violence on other publicly available social media as the event drew closer to include discussion of bringing knives, bats, bike locks, concealed firearms, and potentially gasoline. This information was uncorroborated, and it was unknown if these individuals were in the Boston area or intended to attend the events. Remember, 60 people on one side speaking up for our liberties, 40,000 on the other. This is the mob. The BRIC received uncorroborated information from a credible source indicating that some individuals attending the counter events, that's to say the mob, intended to bring bottles filled with an unknown acid to use against the attendees of the event and law enforcement officers. The BRIC received uncorroborated information from a private citizen that individuals may try to hide weapons in the common in advance of the rallies. The information was investigated, but no weapons were located. A flyer was reported that referenced fascists coming to the Boston Common and displayed white nationalist, neo-Nazi, alt-right symbols and logos, including the thin blue line symbol. So I want to take a moment and talk about this. You do realize that if you are a law enforcement officer, you are being accused of being a fascist and a Nazi. Or if you fly the American Eagle now, you are a fascist or a Nazi. Or if you put up the Christian cross, you are a fascist or a Nazi. Or if you are even a white person who doesn't apologize for the very privilege of your life, you are a fascist and a Nazi. And you start to realize that the people who are going around calling everyone this are the people who are going around and conducting all the violence, who are acting as the tyrants. And I'm not going to call them fascists, because that's not what they are. They're Bolsheviks. They're Red Guards. They're designed to beat you into submission. And what they say is they go and say this politically, and then the political class says to the leaders of law enforcement, to your chief, who's always hired to go ahead and create a public optics, you're not allowed to enforce that. To the FBI, who has an open line to the Anti-Defamation League, who says you're not allowed to enforce that. And you know what happens? No one defends the people. The mob gets bigger and bigger because no one will stand up against that, because I was just following orders. Legitimacy doesn't come from following orders. Authority does. Legitimacy comes from orders being justified, equitable, and fair. You tell me if you can do your job if only some people can ever be found guilty, no matter what crime they commit. Some individuals on public social media referenced attendees being dodged or dodging people in the rally, likely in reference to the vehicular assault at Charlottesville, which involved a Dodge Challenger. Right, so a guy is having his car beat on, just so you understand what happens, and he tries to escape, and he's the worst villain in human history. A guy tries to defend his home in St. Louis, and he's the villain. At what point are we going to call out the violent actors for the terrorists they are? Because the terrorists are winning. You're afraid. So am I. Where are the people who will keep us safe? Where is the law enforcement? Why is the FBI enabling this? Who is paying for this? Is it your tax money? Probably. We know it goes to nonprofits like this. Is it international money? Probably. We know the Chinese Communist Party has sent things in, as well as the Russians. All of them want to destabilize us. What are we seeing this? Criminal activity observed. The Boston Police Department had to arrest 36 individuals for charges including affray, disorderly, unlawful possession of firearms, assault and battery, disturbing public assembly, resisting arrest, carrying dangerous weapons, carrying knives, drinking alcohol in public, trespassing, disturbing the peace, delinquency, and disorderly conduct. Individuals from both the permitted event and counter events were reportedly engaged in physical fights. People aren't allowed to go to the streets. The people who wanted to go out to protest this are silenced. The political class, if someone speaks against this, is buried by a hostile media. The people are said to stay home and cower. And if you even open your business just to survive as a separate entity, you're now a target. How terrible is this? Countergroup attendees reportedly crowded the area and designated as the entrance and exit in attempts to physically assault attendees of the event. Individuals were found with weapons and tactical gear, including loaded firearms, knives, tactical vests, and ball bearings concealed in a Crown Royal bag. And we could read this. Go on. Criminal activity against law enforcement. Officers became the target of violence from many of the attendees of the events, And who was it? The 40,000 mob or the 60 people who were trying to survive and just say, hey, we are the last voice of the Constitution here in New England. And I know someone who was at this rally, man. It was crazy. Individuals reportedly interfered with law enforcement to impede their ability to pursue or arrest suspects and maintain public order. This included stepping in the paths of officers in pursuit, resulting in crash and injury of a bicycle officer, jumping on officers as they intervened in fights, and crowded officers getting people to safety. Individuals reportedly assaulted officers. This is you, police, by biting, spitting, punching, pushing, and hitting them with objects. Objects thrown at officers included bottles filled with urine, traffic cones, rocks, other small objects, and what officers describe as a petroleum gel starter fluid for home grill use. They were getting ready to light you on fire, and yet nothing was done. And you say, it's just our job to keep the peace. How can you keep the peace when the criminals are the candidates and the office holders? How can we accept this? And we're not going to get help. We can't afford to buy officials that will stand up for us. Even when President Trump got elected to theoretically take care of this, the whole bureaucracy worked against him and made everyone who supported him into a criminal. This is what we're dealing with. And if you come from a left-wing perspective, is this justice? Is this what you want? This is what the peaceful protests are. They're a riotous mob of paramilitaries who are using some good people who are misled to go ahead and destroy everything that has value, the safety that protects each and every one of you. If we want safety, we must have security. And not the security of laws that don't have meaning or overweening gain into our lives. Just the basic enforcement of the laws as written. I will settle for that, wouldn't you? Officers had protective gear and department radios ripped off and received blows of sufficient force to crack the shields of their helmets. This happened in Boston, 2017. I could read these all day. Would you like me to? Is this legitimate? Because this is what the government of the United States looks like. The mob says they want something. The political class says, yes, sir, can we have another? And is that right? Is that good? Is it legitimate? Well, let's think of legitimacy. Let's think of the United States. What was the legitimacy we claim? Let's go to the very beginning, to the very Thomas Jefferson statues that are being defaced and torn down. What did Thomas Jefferson say in 1776? The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human advance it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them to another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes to which impel them to separation. When your government ceases to defend you, Jefferson is saying, when it goes ahead and it doesn't defend your liberties, and it doesn't defend virtue, and it doesn't have a political group that will stand up for you, you not only have the right, you have the responsibility to say why you're requiring separation. We here in the Atlantic Nation are doing this through this broadcast, not in one declaration, but in a series of shows where we are presenting to you the case that you deserve better. And whether you are left of center, right of center, white, black, brown, yellow, red, does not matter. You deserve equal protection because a state that will do this to one group will do this to another. A state that believes in mob justice is only waiting for you to give offense. A lesbian who doesn't want to sleep with a tranny. You know, a Muslim who doesn't want to marry a gay person. You pick. We could go through group after group after group because it's not about the justice and complaints of individuals. I think you know that now. It's about the idea that using fights amongst people breaks a system that allows the imposition of its own tyranny. And Jefferson knew that that wasn't the case. The founders knew that, in fact, you needed equal protection under the law. You know, when I was doing my work with New Albion, our third statement in our Bill of Rights in the Atlantic Charter was very clear that we were going to protect the rights of all people equally, where no one gets a benefit any other group doesn't get. That's fair. And that's the closest you can have to equity. Other than that, you can fight over grievances forever, and you will never have a nation. You will never have a homeland. You will never have security. All you'll have is the imposition of force and tyranny. But they didn't want that. What did they want? What did Jefferson want? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator. Why do I talk about morality on this show? Because men are moral because they seek something higher than themselves. The morality of man, as the good book says, is filthy rags where we fight one another and look in the streets at the filthy rags being tossed at us, tossed at our protectors, whose badge is a little bit of silver doesn't mean anything without a whole lot of brass, and the brass at the top is tarnished. With among these unalienable rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Do you consent to having your future determined by angry mobs in the streets, destroying all that was built, all that you own, just because one person said so, or a judge oversteps their powers and ignores the law? I do not. The Atlantic does not. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. We are not happy, we are not safe, we are not protected, we are not treated equally, we are being targeted. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments have long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism. And what is despotism? It is leadership through force despot, a single force that goes ahead and takes over and says, you must do this or we will beat you up. America today. It is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. The law enforcement, you are our guards. Jefferson is speaking to you across the generations. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. This is where we are, ladies and gentlemen. Read your own history. Jefferson described this very situation. He warned us that, it would require blood to keep liberty. The tree of liberty will be watered. Let's continue. I'm going down to the bottom to go ahead and just offer one other thing here. In every stage of these oppressions, and they go through all the lists against King George. I'm not going to read all of them. I recommend you do, but that's fine. We have our own list. We'll go through them in this show. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. And for the decent people of America, let me ask you a question. We've invited people into our homes. We opened our borders. We take in millions of people each year, the United States and Canada alike. We tried multiculturalism. We tried tolerance. We tried, allowing anything and everything. All we asked was to be left alone and for people to have the ability to happily practice under law the safety and security we each thought we were entitled to, and it still wasn't good enough. They did not care. And this is just it. Those petitions are there. A prince whose character is thus marked, and by prince they were talking about King George, but let's put it this way, a government whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. We can be free people and we can go independently and take those risks. Or we can be slaves. We could be serfs. We could be in cattle cars and treated as the herd, because the herd mentality is taking over our country and no one wants to speak against it. Let's see. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our brethren. We have warned them from time to time of the attempts of the legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. Haven't we asked for peace? Haven't we said, what do you want? George Floyd died. Literally, the whole officer was tried. Everything in justice was done. It did not matter, because this isn't about justice, and this isn't about a black man getting killed. This isn't about black people. This isn't about white people. This is about insane utopianism and the mob trying to bring discord to each of us. That's all it is, and we understand that. They have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity to our shared blood. That's what that means. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation, and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, asking God to look with favor upon what we're doing, such as we are too, because we remember we are fighting a spiritual war against an evil force motivated to destroy all that is good, to destroy all that it can. In the name, the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare these united colonies are, and of right ought to be free and independent, that they are absolved from all allegiance, and that all political connection between them and the state is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent they have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other things and acts which independent states may have right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to ourselves, each other, our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. They said that 244 years, or actually I should say more than 244 years ago, right? Because I said that right, 244 years ago. That was the choice that was made. They decided that they could not live with this anymore because they knew they would not be able to live under it. And these were men who stood up for far less provocation than we've had today. And it is not about justice, because it's not being applied to everyone. And it's not about peace, because you see the violence being employed. And it's not about democracy, because the only voice that's being given is to the angry mob. And sadly, we have a state, that has every authority under God and men to act, and has no courage and will, and that is a broken nation. That is the heart of illegitimacy, when one does not have the confidence to act in a justified passion in support of the law. We don't see that anymore. And we cannot hope for that to come forward. The answer is not the next election. The answer is not November. The answer isn't another Trump regime. We let this go, and we, the people, must take it back. And I'm not going to tell you I think it's going to be a republic on the other side of it, but I do think this. We can articulate our grievances, and we must. We can define the liberties we want, and we will. We can imagine the future we require, and we should. And we can talk to one another and appeal, as they said, even with the olive branch petition that directly preceded this, to each other's kindness and reason, and recognizing that the fights that are being led against us, left versus right, white versus black, all of these fights are manipulations for a cynical economic class that wants tyranny and that has done everything it can, nationally and internationally, treasonously in sedition, to destroy these United States. They may tell you I'm a traitor. And maybe that's true because I give no homage to allegiance to the state of the United States of America. But I honor our people, and that's why I'm working to build the Atlantic nation, and I hope you help. And we're going to get there. It's going to be hard, and I probably will be taken down sometime along the way, and that might be as simple as having my podcast taken down, or they may come one day and capture me, slaughter me, incarcerate me, jail me, kill me. Every one of us has to accept this is the world we live in now, because the mob violence has one tool to act. They shout, they scream, they hurt, they kill. And the police aren't going to protect you. But to our brothers in blue, we sure could use you. To the vets whose oath still has meaning, your obligation to the Bill of Rights did not end when the government stopped following it. Give your allegiance to someone who deserves it. That's what we're going to seek here as we go forward. We always end with a bad word and a good word. Let's give you a bad word. Joseph Stalin. Just a couple words. I want you to see. You tell me what fits. The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic. Death is the solution to all problems. No man, no problems. Ideas are more powerful than guns. We would not let our enemies have guns. Why should we let them have more ideas? I don't know, man. I believe in one thing only, the power of the human will. I actually agree with that last thing. Human will is important. This is what the will of the other side says. I could read things all day long, or I could show you bodies. You know, they talk about how bad the Germans were, the Nazis, and a lot of people died. Not here to exonerate that. At least 10 times that died when the communists took power, yet kids go around wearing Che Guevara shirts like it isn't a thing. Mao Zedong thought is considered, and literally, even on Twitter I saw, they want to ban Orwell for anti-Stalinist speech. That's Stalin. This is our leadership group, and it's not everybody. It's 10% of the people at most, but they have the money, they have the power, they have a lot more guns than anyone thought they would, and all they need is for good men to do nothing. Let's give you a good word. Something to give you hope. I always look at the good book for the good word because there's no better word out there. And I'll share what other people say, but today we're going to go to Isaiah 59, and I just want to read just a little bit for you to give you inspiration. These struggles we go against are far older than 200 years, far older than 2,000 years. Surely the arm of the Lord is not too short to save, nor his ear too dull to hear. But your iniquities have separated you from your God. Your sins have hidden his face from you, so that he will not hear. For your hands are stained with blood, your fingers with guilt. Your lips have spoken falsely, and your tongue mutters wicked things. No one calls for justice, no one pleads a case with integrity. They rely on empty arguments, they utter lies, they conceive trouble and give birth to evil. They hatch the eggs of vipers and spin a spider's web. Whoever eats their eggs will die, and when one is broken, an adder is hatched. Their cobwebs are useless for clothing. They cannot cover themselves with what they make. Their deeds are evil deeds, and acts of violence are in their hands. Their feet rush into sin. They are swift to shed innocent blood. They pursue evil schemes. Acts of violence mark their ways. The way of peace they do not know. There is no justice in their paths. They have turned them into crooked roads. No one who walks among them will know peace. So justice is far from us, and righteousness does not reach us. We look for light, but all is darkness, for brightness, but we walk in deep shadows. Like the blind, we grope along the wall, feeling our way like people without eyes. At midday, we stumble as if it were twilight. Among the strong, we are like the dead. We all growl like bears. We moan mournfully like doves. We look for justice, but find one, for deliverance, but it is far away. We are fighting a spiritual battle for the soul of the future of this land. The United States, as we know it, died with COVID. It is a sad story and one we will often lament. It was a great country with many problems that lost itself because it lost a sense of who it was. But as we're reminded here in Isaiah, that in sin, in anger, in violence, in wickedness, there is no solution. There's only the desecration and the devastation must follow. We're not looking to be violent here in the Atlantic, believe it or not. We are looking to walk away with the voice of the sane, legitimacy behind us, law restored, authority and justice, with our brave law enforcement people, our police officers, sheriffs once more, proudly enforcing the law for peace and tranquility. And I have no doubt a fight is coming, and that we will be forced to deal with the creation that we've made. And we can do so, but the hour is late. You know, I find when the Constitution, or at least the Declaration of Independence, agrees with the good book about what you need to do, it's not too hard to know what our ancestors would have said to us across these many years. So let's try a prayer. Heavenly Father, I pray the Spirit of Divine Providence leads this effort to found the Atlantic nation and to lead the people of not just the northeastern nation, but all throughout this great land, a land conceived in liberty, that experience of natural law, which is the state of grace that we have not earned but were given a gift by your Son, that we may gratefully stand up and ask for you to protect us and to give power to our voices as we speak for peace, and that we can wield the sword of righteousness and the armor of God in support of your beliefs and your values, understanding that liberty, with responsibility, being each other's brother's keeper, is the Christian message of the day, and is the message for all free men who seek to find wisdom, which can only be found through you, whether they know it or not, but to which we call once more, and that I pray humbly on behalf of a broken nation and a new one, hoping to be born out of the ashes of what is falling. I will be back on Friday. I should say it in the Father's name, amen. I will be back on Friday, and we will talk much longer about what is being intended for us. I have a number of documents about what Antifa does, what they believe, and I may take a whole episode and read it to you. It's good enough to do that, or at least I will excerpt it. It's 8 pages, and you should know what they say to their own people, because you should know what you're dealing with, and that this is now the governing ideology of the, not just the Democratic Party, but the subservient Republican Party, the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, most mayors, and of course of the mob. And you need to know what to expect if you decide to say, I'm just waiting for the next election. I'm just counting that, this will be put down, because the truth is, everyone is owned, everyone is bought, and there's no one who's going to save us unless we save ourselves. So brothers and sisters, I pray that we find a way to do so here while we still have time. And if you believe what you're hearing makes sense, share it with someone else. Listen to the other voices we have. I want to encourage you to check out our Voices channel, the great work by Kanaz Falan, the work by John Q. Publius, all of this information, and let your voices be heard. You don't agree with me? Send me a letter. I'll cover it. We'll talk about it. We will communicate, and we will come to leadership. But for those who are out there on the front lines who aren't remembered, I just want to say thank you. We still need you. And just remember, just because you're not getting paid to do your job doesn't mean your duty ends. God bless you.